The line was, we were coming back from a tour and our guitars were out of tune. This implies that the members of Mudhoney tuned their guitars once per tour. Hello, and welcome to another episode of 1001 Album Complaints, the show where lifelong friends, musicians, and above all, fans of music who like to show their fanship by researching, opining, and generally rattling on about the tiniest details of every single record they've ever heard get together to tell the story behind some of the most influential albums of all time, as chronicled in Robert Dimery's book 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. We're going to introduce you to this band. We're going to talk about the circumstances that led up to this album getting made and what happened a little bit after it was released. And along the way, we're going to play clips. So don't worry if you're not super familiar with the record right this second. We'll get you caught up in no time. And lastly, at the end of this episode, we are going to vote on whether or not you really needed to hear this particular album before you died. My name is Rob. I've been in love with the liner notes for as long as I can remember, but even as an 8-year-old sifting through my parents' records, I can remember shaking my fists in the air and bellowing for more, damn it, more information. Well, here we are. Today, we're going to be diving into what some notables have called the first ever grunge band. Of course, I'm talking about Mudhoney and their 1991 release, Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge. To get you a quick dip into the mud and honey of it all, here's a clip from the first and only single off this record. It's called Let It Slide. Before we go any further, for any Mudhoney aficionados out there, I should have given our disclaimer at the top. As I mentioned, we're fans of music, we're musicians ourselves, so we know how hard it is to make good music and to put yourself out there by publishing songs. However, it's fun to nitpick and poke fun. Complaints is in the name. We are going to be having a little bit of fun at Mudhoney's expense tonight, all with respect, of course, but get ready to hear us complain about Mudhoney.
No complaints about this album, Rob. None at all.
There's enough people that like Mudhoney. I think their egos will remain unscathed.
They'll be able to handle it. They'll retain their coolness in spite of anything we say here tonight. So we do have a special guest tonight. We're going to get to introducing him after the tweet length reviews, but noise aficionado Conan Neutron has been drafted to help us contextualize this fuzzy beast of a record. And Conan, you're going to give us your tweet first, and then we're going to do a more proper introduction. So let's get to those tweets, those tweet-length reviews of Mudhoney's Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge. We're going to send it around the room, and we're going to go first to Tom.
All right, let me make sure I got my pipes warmed up for this one. Tom, my tweet-length review is, album has chaotic and purposely lo-fi, fuzzed out and relatively fun, but just comes across as unbearably whiny. Yeah, I was almost going to say in true 90s fashion, I didn't write a tweet-length review because fuck it, who cares, right? Slacker culture. But
well, clearly shots fired already, so glad I put the disclaimer out there for your delicate ears. Let's kick it on over to Alan.
Hey, this is Alan here, and my tweet-length review is the pioneers of grunge rock put out an album that actually sounds more reminiscent of 60s garage rock than it does the early 90s rock that it apparently inspired. And the outcome is a reminder that influential does not automatically equal good.
Boosh. Yeah. We're going to hear a rejoinder very shortly, audience. You know, we like to go extra snarky on these tweets for any new listeners right now, and then we'll get into explaining some of our real deeper, more nuanced thoughts. But first, let's hear from our very special guest, rocker Conan Neutron. Give us your tweet.
Yeah, so I would say the best part of bold, stripped-down rock and roll, played with punk rock ferocity, timeless attitude, and hooky songs that almost single-handedly raise the price on affordable vintage fuzz pedals forever.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And this is your humble host, Rob. I'll be walking us down Mudhoney Lane tonight. And my tweet is as follows. Less original than the Stooges, less polished than Nirvana, and with less business savvy than pretty much all of their contemporaries. Mudhoney are the also-rans of the 90s grunge explosion. The most stunning trick they ever pulled off was to remain poor and unknown while major record label gold rushed from seemingly every fire hydrant in their Seattle neighborhood. Okay, I am excited to dive deeper into our general impressions of the album, but first, let's introduce our special guest, the relentless road dog, the unwavering enthusiast, the energetic local show promoter, and the host of long-form musical interview podcast, Protonic Reversal, which just celebrated its 10th anniversary. Welcome, Conan Neutron, to the show.
That's 10 years. 10 years in podcast years is like 300, by the way. So, yeah. Thank you very much. No, it's great to be back. I do enjoy the show, even when I'm yelling at my podcast device about how wrong you are and what idiots you are. And I expect this to be about exactly the same. But I do enjoy the show, and that's the important aspect of it. Yeah, Protonic Reversal, 10-year anniversary show. I just had a bazillion and a half people on. It was almost 3 hours. Ian MacKaye of Fugazi, Steve Albini, Dwayne Dennison, the Jesus Lizard, Jen Finch of L7, Falco McCluskey, Marnie Stern, Dave Paho, Gang of Four and Slint, Bob Bird, Sonic Youth, Alan Johannes, Queens of Stone Age, Cody Willis, Melvins, Dale Cover, Melvins, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on. I have a show. It's a big part of my life. When I'm not touring is what I am doing. And I have had a member of Mudhoney on Protonic Reversal, and not that long ago.
Oh.
And notice that I made sure that I did that before I came on this show.
Nice.
Yeah, you might not have gotten the interview if that was after that.
Yeah. He might have told me to go pound sand. Exactly.
Well, Conan, for any listeners that might not know, Conan Neutron and Protonic Reversal, yeah, if you're a fan of Mudhoney or any of those people he just mentioned, I mean, he's been doing this for 10 years, long-form interviews with great luminaries, especially of the, focused on the indie world. So a lot of great content there. Go check him out. And certainly, if you're a fan of Mudhoney, go check out the Steve Turner interview.
That's right. That's right.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, we're excited to have you on, play against some of our more 70s classic rockist attitudes here. I'm excited to get into the background. We're going to talk about Seattle and some aspects of the grunge scene and where this band came from. But first, I want to dive deeper into our general impressions. Back up or clarify some of the thoughts that you put in that tweet. We'll kick it to Tom first.
So I missed the boat on Mudhoney in the grunge era, as I think a lot of people my age did. We sort of were being fed the more commercially successful bands on the radio, and that is what I gravitated towards. So I heard the name growing up, but I never bought the album, so I don't have a nostalgia for this album. So I'm kind of taking it at its face, and I don't have a whole lot of my emotions freighted with it. I realize it's early grunge. It's raw. Grunge right before, like a Steve Albini or a Butch Vig gets involved in the production of it and puts a little bit of that polish and sheen on it that made a lot of the other grunge bands appeal to the mass audiences. And I think this might be the album that makes me realize that I'm a basic bitch and I like that sheen and I like the polish a little bit and I like the softened edges a little bit. So listen, at its best, this album's got a lot of energy, heavy distortion, shouty, unintelligible lyrics, tasteful noise. But at its worst, it sounds like guys who don't give a shit making music that they don't give a shit about, and neither should I. So I was kind of caught between two worlds on this one. I get the 90s slacker aesthetic, and I did have fun listening to the album, and I'm on the fence. I'm ready to be convinced as to why this is essential, but it didn't hit me that way upon my first several listens.
So after all that snark, thank you, Tom, I'd love to just say a few things that I do like about the record, because I'm kind of in the same position. I'm in the same age group as Tom, and I bought Nevermind on tape right when it came out, and it was very exciting, but I missed the boat on Mudhoney. What I like about this record, it rocks. I think unequivocally it rocks. It, particularly the drumming, I think is exceptional. I really think the drummer drives the band, perhaps in the way of all great bands. It's energetic. It is lo-fi. And to be honest, based on what I thought I was going to get on the recording versus what I got, this is way more 60s psych or garage than I was expecting it to be. So that was a pleasant surprise for me. That said, I feel some of the same things that Tom said, which is I think that polish, not just in the production, but in the working the songs a little harder, caring a little more, and making it a little more digestible by the masses, did serve bands like Nirvana. Well, obviously it served them well, but I also think it created really, really good music. So my main focus is going to be on that question of essentialness. Now, because I did enjoy the record, it grew on me over time. I think it's a fun record. I will probably listen to it again. Let me just say that right off the bat. But is it absolutely essential? And Robert Dimery put 2 Mudhoney releases on his 1001 albums You Must Hear Before You Die. And so I'm starting from a position open to being changed, but I'm starting from a position of there is no way in hell that 2 are required on that list.
Hard disagree, by the way. Hard disagree, but well, I'll have my time. It's fine.
Well, why don't you take your time now? Let's hear it. I want to hear why I am coming away with the wrong impression of this album.
Okay, so first of all, you mentioned Danny Peters, the drummer for Mudhoney, who is almost objectively excellent and has an interesting style. Also briefly did time in Nirvana, too. Played in Nirvana as a fill-in, and before Dave Grohl was one of the people that they actually were like, should we ask this guy into the band? And then I think were like right on the fence about it, but like Mudhoney was one of their favorite bands and they didn't want Mudhoney to end. But Danny Peters is on a few of the songs from Incesticide, like the Sliver single, if I remember correctly, and like another one, things along those lines.
I'm going to cover that in the background, Conan. Why are you taking my fire, buddy?
Okay. Look, man. And the other record that's on the list is the self-titled record, which is most people's go-to. It's most people's go-to because Mudhoney is a strange case of...
Super Fuzz Big Muff.
You're right. It's Super Fuzz Big Muff that is actually... It's got their first song ever. The first song they ever released, which is Touch Me, I'm Sick. And it is objectively their biggest
I got to correct you again, Conan. I'm sorry. Maybe we could cut all this, but... Listen, we're talking about Every Good Boy, so I want to hear your thoughts on Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge. But Super Fuzz Big Muff is Dimery's other pick. It's the first release by Mudhoney, but it is in fact an EP. The one that is in the published version of the book that I have refers to the EP. It does not include the single Touch Me, I'm Sick. I'm just saying all this is context for its relative essentialness. Now, I think we can agree right off the bat that that is a rawer, wilder version of Mudhoney.
Yes.
So that's the comparison I want to draw. But tell me why Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge is so good in your opinion.
Well, and I was about to until you interrupted me to correct me on those facts, which I appreciate.
Well, it's my job, I just have to talk all the time.
So Touch Me, I'm Sick is like it's one of their first songs, and it's still to this day one of their biggest songs. And then Super Fuzz Big Muff, again, the name of 2 fuzz pedals that they used at the time. You could get like a pawn shop for like $40, and now it's more like $400. That it defined a certain sound that people were thinking that's what this band is. There was other luminaries that had been in other bands and things along those lines. They actually had other things that they wanted to do with the band and more depth that they were digging deeper into, that they didn't want that just to be a snapshot in time. Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, again, it's not an accident that you mentioned it sounds like, 60s kind of throwback psychedelia, et cetera, because those guys are big fans of things like Nuggets and stuff along those lines. And they wanted to take those types of songs and those types of forgotten, weird bands at the time, like the Sonics and things along those lines, and do like their version of that, melded with the same kind of energy that they got off of seeing bands like Black Flag and the punk rock movement. That's their whole raison d'etre.
You should probably explain. I know that your Protonic Reversal audience probably all know what Nuggets is, but...
I've had Lenny K on the show.
So please tell our audience what it is.
Nuggets is a sprawling, expansive compilation of obscure garage rock bands, psychedelic bands, and just freaks, nerds, and weirdos from the 60s that were not on Dimery's list or anyone else's, because... chances are maybe they even didn't even record more than one song. But if you look at it from a perspective of like the American folk anthology along those lines, it's the weird rock and roll of that time. It's an authored, curated experience to be able to experience all these bands that never had their heyday.
So it was a compilation made by another musician as a labor of love to try to rescue potentially forgotten 60s
Yep.
garage bands, but it ended up being very, very influential. And it's come up on this show before.
Lenny Kaye, who played guitar for Patti Smith and still continues to do so. Mudhoney is maybe the first and most notable, most Nuggets influenced band. So when I say that every good boy deserves fudge deserves to be on here, it's because I'm talking about that they were, they stood by Touch Me, I'm Sick. They stood by all the Super Fuzz Big Mouth stuff, but that was their baby pictures as a band. And again, we're talking at a time that like the Steve and Mark's bandmates in Green River were starting up Pearl Jam.
Yeah.
Like that's what was happening. That band's basically split up because they were kind of going opposite directions of what they wanted to do. And so it was a weird time where they're kind of letting the freaks in, especially if the freaks happen to be from the Pacific Northwest. But their roots are just that, like that short, concise rock and roll, the fuzzy guitar sounds. Again, hard to overstate how uncool fuzz guitar was at the time that this came out. Now it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's back in the zeitgeist.
We're going to get into it. I hear what you're saying, and I think they deserve credit for helping incite or fuel a revolution. They were against the grain, at least certainly when they started. Mm-hmm. But in the context of their Seattle scene, they weren't that weird. Nirvana also existed at this point. So my question is more about, we are going to try to put it in context as we go, and I encourage you to keep jumping in and giving your thoughts. But Alan, let's hear from you.
I didn't know much about this band other than a few of the tracks. I was familiar with Suck You Dry and a few other things, but I didn't really know much about what they sounded like. And so I went in with an expectation that they would sound like the bands that I ended up loving as a kid, that we all ended up loving as a kid. And they totally didn't. But I will say something I was struck by in doing research for this record, I couldn't help but notice how often either a reviewer, a critic, or a user reviewer or whatever said something like, I don't know how they weren't as successful or why they weren't as successful as like the big four of grunge. And really, you listen to this and I don't say this to like disparage it, but there's no way you can listen to this and actually wonder why they were not like hugely commercially successful. They were not trying to do that at all. And I think that was one thing I was struck by, was how flagrantly they were trying to avoid manufactured, packaged pop music, which I respect and have no problems with. But I do think the music itself was not my speed, was not for me. It felt a little bit half-baked. And quite frankly, I felt like it felt a little bit like average bar music. I'm okay with that, but I just, as a listener on an album with headphones on, that's just the vibe I got.
I'd love to see the bar band playing Who You Driving Now, by the way. But yeah, okay, go ahead.
Well, to be fair, in a bar, you're not always paying attention either. So that was kind of the thing too, where it's like, hey, it's a vibe, it's a feel. Some of it's okay, some of it's rough and forgettable. I didn't feel like I took a lot away from this and said, oh, this part was like really memorable, or this thing they did was like, yeah, that really stuck with me. It didn't land for me quite that way, but.
Well, that's why the context is going to be important. We always know that the context of where this band came from, what scene and time period they were arising out of, is going to be so crucial to telling that story.
They're smartasses too. They're way irreverent smartasses, and that's one of the reasons why, again, Mudhoney was never going to be as big as Nirvana. It's just because they can't help themselves to a certain degree. In the music, in the fact that their major label debut, Piece of Cake the Next One, which has the incredible song Suck You Dry, they put a bunch of interstitials in of just, I can charitably characterize as goof-ass shit that they just thought was funny.
Just trying to get onto the hip-hop scene where they were putting all those skits in between.
They were like making fun of stuff like that, and cool, but maybe this wasn't the time to do that. And Suck You Dry, by the way, which has a great video that has them playing in a club, already making fun of the fact that the grunge explosion was over, right? And there's somebody that holds up a sign that says "grunge out," which is pretty amazing if you ask me.
It does seem very on brand for them to sort of disavow themselves of that label. Like, that is not surprising in the least.
Like, especially Steve Turner and eventually Mark Arm, the Green River guys, they had a creative differences about how to proceed, and those guys wanted a more commercial sound, hence Pearl Jam. Ultimately,
Yeah, I mean, is there a band that collectively has missed out on more potential money by one guy not being in Nirvana and the other guys not being in Pearl Jam? Like,
yet Mudhoney's still around and tours and plays and makes records and plays to beloved fans worldwide, and Nirvana.
Yes. Listen, I have to say, because this was my main problem with the album, and I can't believe nobody has brought it up. The vocal delivery and production.
You brought brought it up immediately.
Nobody else besides me brought it up. The vocal delivery and production of this album is goddamn terrible, and I cannot abide by the way that they produced the vocals specifically. I am not saying I hate Mark Arm's voice. I will say I don't like his voice, but I don't think that he was done any favors in the way that it was recorded and presented. In the way that they do the double tracking, it is not giving him the kind of beef that you need to have, because it's often so imprecise in the double tracking. And then a lot of times when he goes up, they undercut the emotion and the force of him going up by putting a lower track underneath it, and it just makes it sound so washed out and muddy. And that was frankly the thing that kept me from enjoying the album more, because the band rocks, and I really do enjoy the band a whole lot. And I 100% agree. Dan Peters is an awesome drummer. Flawless, no notes. His drums are fantastic. Lucan gets a couple of awesome chances to stand out as well. The rhythm section is on point. But kind of every time Mark Arm started singing, I was just like, maybe a little less of that and a little bit more of the band.
Let's dive in to where this band came from, because we got a lot to get through, and we're going to take... You can't tell the story of Mudhoney without telling at least some of the story of the Seattle grunge rock scene of the late 80s and early 90s, and with it a bit about stories of a handful of other bands around Mudhoney and one fledgling independent record label, which Conan already mentioned, called Sub Pop. So this is going to be a fairly superficial look at those other things, as we'll be focused on Mudhoney primarily. And I imagine we're going to get back to that Seattle story when we eventually cover the other great records from that same scene that are also on Mr. Dimery's list, like Nevermind by Nirvana or Super Unknown by Soundgarden or 10 by Pearl Jam. But I want to mention that for research, I did read a bunch of articles and interviews with the band, of course, but I also read Steve Turner's, the lead guitar player's, memoir called Mud Ride, and I also went back and reread the Mudhoney chapter of Our Band Could Be Your Life, which I know we've referenced before here on the show, but it's a reminder, it's a journalistic look at a series of indie bands from all over America in the 80s, like Minutemen, Sonic Youth, Replacements, and Mudhoney, and I would recommend it to anybody who likes these bands. It's a great way to think about and to learn more about these bands and what the landscape was like during that time. Okay, cast your minds back to early 80s in Seattle, before Amazon, before Microsoft, right? It's a small town in a far corner of the continental United States. It wasn't really even a tour stop for big bands because it's too far from other cities to make it make sense or to make money, and it's also got a very small population at that time. But in the 80s, there started to be this DIY scene, like we're talking about, like Minutemen, of bands just hopping in a van, supporting tours completely on their own. They weren't really as burdened by the need to make a profit, and they were also doing it much more cheaply. So they started coming through, and Seattle became a place where bands would come in, especially these independent bands, Black Flag, Minutemen, Minor Threat, places like that. So a community starts growing up there. And they're also consuming these early skateboarding videos and punk rock, which is consistently being used in those videos. And again, those early independent bands like Minor Threat and Black Flag, they're pushing the limits of speed and intensity via a genre called hardcore, right? It's worth mentioning that independent, or the label of independent or indie back then, specifically meant not signed to one of a handful of major record labels, right? It was a much more centralized system then, with a handful of huge record label conglomerates. And this was early in the days of making your own independent record label was even a thing. It's kind of like the term microbrew. It's like somewhat lost its meaning over the years. People use indie in a lot of different ways over the years, but it really meant something very specific back then. So this was an era where people were just starting those small scale record labels with very, very small distribution footprints. And they were gaining loyal fan bases on this kind of underground word of mouth scene, but they weren't making a ton of money. They weren't big time yet, right? And of course, we can't talk about this era without talking about fanzines. Before the internet, hard to fathom, people self-printed, usually black and white kind of magazines, and sent them out along with personally made mixtapes, including, it looks like Conan maybe had a fanzine at some point. And they'd send them out to subscribers along with mixtapes that they made, dubbed tapes that they put mixes on and things like that. And these got passed around from hand to hand between older brothers and younger brothers. And this is basically how non-mainstream music, stuff that was not on the radio or MTV, was getting discovered.
Conan, I need to know, what was the name of your fanzine?
It was Destructive Images.
Destructive Images. Okay. You guys were covering, I'm sure at the time, like the Spice Girls and just like that scene. Yeah.
Lots of punk rock stuff, things like Evil Dead, like that type of like countercultural stuff in general. But it's how I first started interviewing people, and I was not very good at it, but I got better. But I will say that a lot of times I feel like the podcasting space at its best has taken up the mantle for a lot of what zine culture did. It's just done in a different format because it opened up because the whole thing about it is that passionate people with deep interests would be able to share those interests with people who also felt the same way and or were curious. And what is that if not for podcasting now, right?
Yeah, totally. You might be from a small town in Iowa, and you might be the only Mudhoney fan in your town, or maybe there's 5 of you, but finding each other was quite hard in those days. And this is the kind of stuff that did it, or of course at shows. So in this story, there's a lot of bands. There's a handful of names. I'm going to try to keep it simple for everyone as we go and only talk about what's really necessary or fun to talk about. But let's talk about the members of Mudhoney that are on Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge first, and then we'll dive into their respective paths through this Seattle scene. So first we have Steve Turner, who plays lead guitar. We already mentioned him. He was a guest on Conan's podcast recently. We have Mark Arm, who also plays guitar and is the lead singer. We have Dan Peters on drums, mention him as well, and Matt Lukin on bass. So I read Steve Turner's memoir, so I'll tell a little bit of this from the perspective of Steve Turner. And of course, Conan, chime in since you talked to the man recently, but I imagine some of the information will be similar. So he grows up in the Seattle area. He starts getting into hardcore and the punk scene through skateboarding, like a lot of young kids at the time. And he starts meeting up with other kids who are into skating, punk, metal music, forms a band in 1982 called the Ducky Boys with a buddy from high school called Stone Gossard. That name's probably somewhat familiar to you if you care about these types of things, because Stone ends up several years later being the lead guitar player in a band called Pearl Jam.
Anything ever happened with that guy? Did he do anything? Yeah.
Total schlub. I do find it interesting that like all of these kids are into skateboarding and music. Skateboarding, the most likely thing to break your hands and wrists, right. And music, the thing you absolutely need hands and wrists for.
That's funny.
So Steve also meets up with other Mudhoney member Mark Arm at a punk show in the early 80s. And Mark's like a year or two older than him. And Mark is running a small fanzine himself at that time called The Attack, which was apparently reasonably widely distributed. And they said whose readers include people like Butthole Surfers and Sonic Youth. And he already had a band together as well called Mr. Ep and the Calculations, sometimes abbreviated Mr. Ep.
I have a Mr. Ep and the Calculations cassette tape, by the way.
Sweet.
Inept Devo worship, but you gotta love it. Like it's all heart.
That is, yeah, it's good to remember that Devo were very much associated with this scene, and I think the show that Steve and Mark met up at might have been a Devo show. I'm not 100% sure.
That sounds right.
But Steve definitely talked about when Devo came to his town and he went as like a 15-year-old. He was his mind was blown, and he was like, I have to do this. So they're not, I'm pointing out that Devo's not quite thought of that way now, or that Sands of Time don't put them in the same category, but they were very punk rock at the time. So neither band, Ducky Boys or Mr. Ep, was really all that great, or the people weren't really all that committed to it. This is by Steve and Mark's own admission. And they weren't really striving for that much, but they become fast friends because of their love of the same kinds of bands, right? So Ducky Boys ends up breaking up. That's Steve Turner's band. Mark and Steve are already thinking about their next project together. Sorry, both bands break up. They're thinking about their next project together. And they've got their eyes on a bass player from the scene called Jeff Ament. Now, I'm guessing everyone here in the studio knows this already, but for those who might not know, Jeff Ament also went on to play in the band Pearl Jam. He's the bass player in Pearl Jam. I thought there was a funny anecdote that Steve relates, which is Jeff Ament's like so cool in their minds, they want him for their band because he jumps around on stage and uses a bass distortion pedal. The only problem is that he freaking hates the band Mr. Ep, Mark Arm's old band. So recruiting him is going to be a little bit tough, but they pull a classic teenage move, a caper, if you will, which is that Steve decides to get a job at the coffee shop where Jeff works to befriend him and effectively wear him down to join their band. And it works.
That's a long play. Good Lord.
Yeah, joining a band that you hate is kind of a tough proposition.
Well, it was a new band, but from the makers of a band that you actively hated.
Mr. Ep and the Calculations was not what you would say a beloved entity is probably the best way to put it. And also, again, they were more focused on like doing the thing and like building up the mythos around it than actual, say, songwriting. It was pretty gnarly. Like, and I say that as someone that I've listened to a lot of the early bands that these guys have done, and it's interesting. You know, that you can drive a truck through when somebody says that's interesting, right? Yeah.
Sure.
Also, the drummer for Mr. Up and the Calculations also played in Sealable Bathtub as well, which is another favorite of mine. So
Nice.
let the record show, ...
I know. Let's get a job at the same place that this guy has. It's just buy a bunch of weed and be like, I got a bunch of weed. You want to come over? Like, that's the solution to get the guy in your band. Get him high and jam. It'll happen.
I think Steve might have been kind of straight edge at this point, because keep in mind, straight edge was a big strain of punk music.
Yeah, he wasn't like steadfastly like so, but definitely not. What wasn't really his vibe to say that.
Yeah. We're still in proto Mudhoney era, but I'm kind of talking about the makings of this scene, right? So now they have a trio: Jeff Ament, future bass player of Pearl Jam. We have Steve Turner and Mark Aram. In the future, there will be of Mudhoney. But Mark decides, man, I don't really want to be burdened in this band by playing guitar. I just need to be the front man. I need to be free, dude. So they recruit Stone Gossard to sign on as the second guitar player, and this band is called Green River. It's already been mentioned here on the show, but just for some context, let's play a quick clip of the title track from the first Green River album, Come On Down. So I thought let's just talk about the sound of the music itself, because some people would say this band is the first grunge band, right? How do you get to the grunge rock sound? You had hardcore, which was punk sped up to the max, but at a certain point, there's literally no faster you can go. So it kind of starts to turn back around.
Yeah, especially if you're straight edge, you're not just doing a bunch of speed.
Right.
Come on, guys.
And it's interesting how these musical threads weave together, because another thing that's happening at the time is metal music is creeping into the punk scene. So thrash metal is happening, especially down in Southern California. It's undeniably fast. It's heavy, similar aesthetics in a way to hardcore punk music, right? But a specific local reason that there was some cross-pollination is there was a little 2-room venue in Seattle at the time called Guerrilla Gardens, and they had a metal room for metal bands to play, and right next door they had a punk room for punk bands to play. And in most nights, paying one cover would get you into both rooms.
Good value.
So the scenes kind of started cross-pollinating a bit. So in any case, guys like Stone Gossard were way more into metal, whereas Steve Turner and Mark Aram were way more into punk music and hardcore. But they were starting to blend together into something, and I think that's how you get the sound of bands like Green River.
That's right.
I hear a lot more 70s in Green River, a lot more Led Zeppelin-esque riffage than you get into future Mudhoney.
I heard Sabbath a lot.
Or Sabbath, exactly, yeah. By the way, we mentioned it on a previous episode long ago, I want to say in the 80s, the Guns N' Roses episode, but Duff McKagan of Guns N' Roses was also a part of this scene, playing in bands.
It was a Seattle dude.
Yeah, playing in bands like The Farts and 10 Minute Warning. And as an aside, all the Mudhoney guys went and saw Guns N' Roses' second show ever, which was in Seattle, and they were like excited to be supporting their hometown hero Duff, who had very publicly left Seattle for LA a while back. And then they saw the show, and they were all like, "I cannot believe Duff left Seattle for this bullshit."
He's like, Seattle's not sleazy enough for me. I got to get down to LA.
Right.
How could you leave the farts?
Which brings us to a new segment on the show we're calling Is It Punk?, where I give you a prompt and you have to tell me if it's punk or not. Now, please ring in by saying your own first name and then waiting to be recognized by me. You guys ready?
Yes, but I will not abide by the rules.
First clue for Is It Punk? We're going with Neil Young.
Conan, yes.
I asked you to wait to be recognized by me, Conan. Conan, I now recognize you.
Yes, absolutely. There's few people can claim the proto-punk moniker more than Neil Young, which counts in the same way that Stooges and whatnot count.
Yes, absolutely. He's the godfather of punk. He stabs at the guitar like a disenfranchised dock worker and maintains a strong Sasquatch against authority position even to this day. Next clue, Frank Zappa. Tom.
No.
Why?
Because it's too musical.
That's correct. He cares way too much about musical knowledge and craftsmanship and actively derides those who don't. I recently heard an anecdote that after Steve Vai's auditioned for him in the 80s, he made fun of him publicly by suggesting that Linda Ronstadt might be looking for a guitar player.
Ooh, jeez.
There you go.
Side note, Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention would qualify. It's weird, it's anti-establishment, it's straight edge, it's very punk.
Yeah.
Okay, next clue. Weird Al Yankovic.
No, I love Weird Al, but Weird Al is not punk. He's too nice.
That's correct. You guys are batting 1,000. Weird Al is very, very cool, interesting, and a world-class weirdo leading the charge for all nerds everywhere. Nothing, repeat, nothing involving accordion can ever be punk. Okay, we have one last clue for Is It Punk, the new segment, and the clue is the theme song from children's cartoon show Rugrats.
I know the answer to this is yes, because it was it written by one of the guys in Devo?
Yes, punk pervades everything the members of Devo touch and is inherited in perpetuity. Even the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that Jared Casale packs into his daughter's lunchboxes are punk. That's it for our first ever round of Is It Punk? Perhaps someday it will rise to the level of our favorite segment, dethroning the current champion.
Jerry Casale's also been in Protonic Reversal at least 4 times, maybe 5.
Go listen to Protonic Reversal. Listen to
Jesus Christ, dude.
Yeah, I know. Listen to Conan talk for literally hours to these literal luminaries.
I want to steal your Rolodex, Conan.
Very entertaining.
I'm picturing you had a literal Rolodex that you're just leaping through cards here.
Exactly. I call it to my secretary as I pull down the Sam Spade bed from like the bookshelf when I sit in my studio.
Okay, back to our story. So Green River, like I said, are arguably the first ever grunge band, in part because in a description of their release by the then new indie label Sub Pop, the music was described as ultra loose grunge that destroyed a generation. So that is arguably the first time grunge was used in print, although I did hear a couple other stories, one involving Mark Arm sending a letter to some local music editor about Mr. Epp, his earlier band, from the point of view someone who'd been to the show of theirs and hated it, like calling to complain and calling it pure grunge. That's kind of a funny idea. I give credit for that.
Yeah, he's a smart dude. Too smart for their own good is definitely something they would cop to.
Yeah, you know? I'm not co-signing that just yet, but we're gonna get to that. But that's definitely clever. I like that. There's a point to Mudhoney there. So Sub Pop started in Seattle, right? But their first couple releases are from outside the Seattle area, and part of that is the mindset that at the time there wasn't really any belief that a Seattle band could make it outside the local scene. Right? They just didn't fathom that they could ever have widespread appeal because it was still this geographically isolated little place. Now, at the same time, turmoil was afoot because Green River started wearing makeup to the gigs, and Jeff and Stone were pushing it more towards 70s rock like Kiss and Bowie, and on Iron Maiden, heavier, slower. And Steve quits because he doesn't like the direction they're going in. So Green River went on. They made a couple records. They were relatively short-lived, in part because, as Conan already said, they argued about not only the musical direction of the band, but whether or not to pursue a major label deal and about the overall ambitions of the band. Stone and Jeff really wanted to go for it. They really felt they wanted to make it in music. They're very serious about it. Mark, not so much. Interestingly, Jeff Ament talks about a story where they were in L.A. with Green River, opening up for Jane's Addiction, and him and Stone Gossard were watching Jane's Addiction, thinking, wow, these guys are so awesome. Like, how could we be this good? I'm excited to go back to band practice. And Mark just walks up behind him and goes like, how lame is this?
Right.
It was little things like that just, they weren't on the same page. In fact, Jeff Ament had the audacity to suggest that Mark Arm get some vocal lessons. And I think that might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. So Green River, they eventually break up, and Jeff and Stone go on to form a new band. Not yet Pearl Jam. This one's called Mother Love Bone, and they have some success. They record an album, but tragically, their lead singer dies of a heroin overdose shortly before their debut album with a major label, Polygram, shortly before it gets released. And I bring up this little digression for 2 reasons. One, because I learned this week, and I think these threads are interesting. Andrew Wood, the singer who died, was roommates with Chris Cornell, who, along with the dude's bandmates, were obviously devastated and quickly wrote some songs about it in tribute. They also recruited a San Diego-based singer for his first appearance ever on a record, and his name was Eddie Vedder, and that's Temple of the Dog. They had a hit with Hunger Strike.
I'm going hungry. Yeah.
Wasn't that Say Hello to Heaven was about the guy who overdosed, though, right? Let's say hello to heaven. Yeah.
I think the album they released was a mixture of songs that maybe Andrew Wood had written or worked on with the band, combined with stuff that they wrote about their friend dying. So that meeting also leads to Eddie Vedder joining up with basically the remaining members of Mother Love Bone, and in only a few short months, they head into the studio to record 10 as Pearl Jam. So this is all happening in the spring of 1991, really right around the same time this Mudhoney record was recorded. Okay, one other fun little digression into the Seattle scene that I thought you guys would like is that even while Green River is still going on, Steve and Mark remain friends, even though Steve's not in the band anymore. And Steve ends up joining another band, an avant-garde fuck band called the Thrown Ups, which then Mark eventually joins him in. Now, in Seattle slang, a fuck band is like your second band that doesn't mean that much to you. Yeah. It's just a throwaway that you do it on the side. It's a fuck band. So the Thrown Ups are 100% improvised. Like, no practice, no songs, just get on stage and make things happen. The band described themselves as sounding like vomit looks. Mm-hmm. And to me, the funniest part of this, and the part I actually like about that sounds terrible to listen to, of course.
It sounds unlistenable.
But, I don't know. You got my attention at this point.
Before they said that before they'd hop up on stage, they'd quickly scribble out meaningless song titles on a quote unquote set list. And the idea that like these silly made up song titles, like made up literally seconds before they stepped on stage, could influence like what got played there is really funny to me.
And it's funny because there are Thrown Ups recordings. They're not great, but like they are.
You don't say.
But there is one Thrown Up song where the guitar line that would become, if I remember right, "You Got It," "Keep It Out of My Face," maybe one of Steve Turner's most timeless guitar hooks, is in that song, but it's like an antediluvian Neanderthal version of it. And it's so weird to hear a very unique and, you know, if you're into a certain kind of music, iconic guitar hook in this puddle of nonsense that's happening.
So you're saying the guitar playing was less sophisticated in this band?
A little less sophisticated, yes.
Listen, okay. I will say, that sounds fun.
Steve Turner's a badass. He's one of my favorite guitar players, by the way. But he's this very specific style, and something I will say.
He sounds fine, and I like his tone, actually. However, and I think he gets off plenty of good riffs, and there's a lot of energy in the playing. But I'm rejecting the idea that it's like this poured over, I'm dialing in the riff one note at a time, 1/16th note beat at a time. Like I'm sorry, that's not happening, dude.
He's a field player, and actually one of the coolest things I ever heard him say is that like when it comes time to guitar leads, something that he would swear by is that he would go to play it, and if he hit a wrong note, he would just slide into the right note.
That is my MO as a stringed instrument player. Is there on a wrong?
I was like,
notes.
that's so cool. Like, and like I thought, honestly, as a young guitar player, when I heard that, I was like, God, that's a good idea.
Yeah. And then if you do it again, it becomes jazz. We're just like, yeah, I've done it twice now. It's on purpose.
Composed. I'm avant-garde.
Back to the Mudhoney story. Mark and Steve are still playing together. They're wanting to get more serious about the Thrown Ups now that Green River, the serious band, has ended. So they float the idea of being in a band that rehearses their material, at least occasionally. And the lead singer, Ed Fotheringham, is like, no way, Jose, I'm out of here. So I'm serious.
I've got integrity. There's no way I'm going to do that. Yeah, exactly.
I'm not giving up on my aesthetics.
No, you want to talk about what is punk? That's fucking punk.
That is fucking punk rock. That's right.
So they need some new band members. But luckily, Ed Fotheringham landed on his feet because he's an illustrator who's published several kids' books, and he did the cover for the album we're listening to this week. Now, luckily, they had recently jammed with drummer Dan Peters, and they asked him to come record a single with them, and he says yes, which is rather surprising to Mark and Steve, because Dan is one of the most sought-after, overbooked, busiest drummers on the scene. It's a total coup. I did read that Dan clarified that he only said yes in the moment because he was on ecstasy at the time. So. Now, the last member of the band has to come in to make it Mudhoney, Matt Lukin, who was a founding member of Melvins. For a handful of years, he played in Melvins with Buzz and Dale when they were based up in Washington State. But those guys decided to move to the Bay Area and replace him with Buzz's girlfriend, which Matt Lukin still seems rather salty about.
He is, and mostly because they didn't even tell him, which is amazing.
Ooh.
This is also the point where I say that Dale Cover plays with me from Melvins. So that's good. So partiality out the window.
Yeah.
That is a Hall of Fame dick move up there with Metallica kicking out Cliff Burton and like making him let his own, not Cliff Burton, Dave Mustaine. Find your own way back, dude.
Yeah, but literally just like being, like 3,000 miles from home, being like, I don't know, I guess you should get on a bus or something.
Honestly, just saying that on this show, Matt Lukin just woke up, probably surrounded by beer bottles and potato chip wrappers, and like started ranting about it, basically. That's like, it's something that he's still hot on. He's got a lot of thoughts.
I watched the documentary, and he did mention it a few times. But in any case,
and it was like
he's now
40 years
he's
ago.
Now freed
like
up.
how long was it? Like something like that. But yeah, anyway.
So I do wonder, though, if I'd hate to be crass and bring it all back to money, but did he make more money playing in Mudhoney than he would have continuing in Melvins? Like, who sold more?
Melvins was not making money at this point. Pre-Bullhead, Melvins were in no way making. If they went on tour, there was like 5 people and a drunk dog showing up at their show. You know, it was like, that's one of the reasons why they just stopped touring. And then like they put out Bullhead, and that led to, mostly through the association with Nirvana, the Atlantic records, and then they built this ferocious attached audience that they've just engaged with and continued going to this day. Mudhoney, strangely, different path, did the same sort of thing. Mudhoney plays to this day. Lukin quit and was replaced by Guy Madison. Other than that, it's been the same dudes the entire 35 plus years that they've been a band. Like, they put out a record last year. It's pretty good. They're all pretty good. They have a dedicated audience and tour the world to this day on an adventure basis. So...
Well, and even in the interviews I've seen, they admit that too. They're very open about like, hey, everyone's best stuff is at the very beginning, but we still like what we're doing. And I get the sense that they're not just saying it. I'm sure they, in their heart of hearts, probably feel like they left some meat on the bones, but financially anyway. But I get the sense that they do seem truly content with like, hey, we're working musicians, we're making a living, we've got a cool legacy, and that's more than most people can say.
Of course, they've achieved way more than any of us ever will in music, obviously. But that said, they are, even at this early stage, kind of having a hard time committing to any one thing, and they're not overly ambitious in terms of what they're trying to do with their music. So now that the core 4 has formed up, they decide to call the band Mudhoney. It's named after a Russ Meyer film. And they quickly record a single called Touch Me, I'm Sick. It's already been mentioned, and it becomes kind of a minor hit. And on the strength of that, they follow up with an EP called Super Fuzz Big Muff, as we said, named after 2 guitar pedals. Also on Dimery's list, they become Sub Pop's flagship band, and they tour Europe. I think they're the first Seattle band, from this scene around that time to tour Europe. They're doing well. They're kind of the flag bearers, not just for the label, but for the scene itself, right? Now, a note on American band success in the UK at this time. Sub Pop figured out that Brits love the idea of American archetypes, making quintessentially American music, like lumberjacks who, after working at the mill since the age of 7, stumble into the recording studio and bang this stuff out like American cavemen.
Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter. It fits the trope. Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't matter. That worked in the UK, and they leaned into it, and Mudhoney really was much more successful in the UK than in the US.
Well, maybe that's why the UK loved CCR so much. Maybe they thought they were like these guys that were from Louisiana Bayou and but they're from like Berkeley. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, but that's another example of something that consistently annoyed the bands, many of whom were relatively well-educated suburban kids. Mark and Steve both come from, they're pretty well-heeled. Their parents worked for Boeing and places like that, right? But it got them press in the UK. It made them a phenomenon there, which is probably, as we've mentioned many times before, why British author Robert Dimery has 2 of their releases in this book, I would guess. But okay, as we approach the making of this album, Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, the band is still in a bit of turmoil, like I mentioned. They've already had much more success than any of them had planned for. It's starting to seem like hard work, and these guys just don't have a ton of ambition for a life in the music business. They're still thinking of Seattle as like a far-flung corner. They can't fathom Seattle bands are on the verge. They're literally on the verge of breaking through and becoming the dominant force in music, but it has not happened yet, and that prospect just seems insanely unrealistic. So it's like, why should we keep striving, right? Also, after the success and some buzz around that initial single and that initial EP, they released their self-titled full-length, and doesn't do quite as well, and it seems like no one in the band is all that jazzed about it. It feels like more of the same. They're not feeling super duper inspired. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the last reason is that Mark Arm is, well, strung out on heroin and not super engaged with anything that's going on. So Steve is leading the charge here. They head back into the studio anyway to make a second record with Sub Pop, second full length, that is. Their goal is to change things up. They start out in late 1990, making this record at a session with Jack and Dino over at a place called Music Source. And this is the guy they made all the previous stuff with. And the studio and the recording engineer, he's like the scenester choice for the grunge bands, even though they don't call themselves that. But the bands of Seattle, he's the choice for bands that want to sound fuzzy and grungy and rock and roll like they are. But unfortunately, something's happened. The studio has been upgraded to like more tracks. They now have 16 tracks. And they do some recordings there, but they hate it. It's all too clean or too samey or, whatever it is. And so they're like, no, we can't use any of that. None of that makes it to the record. So instead, they throw a curveball. They call up a guy across town called Conrad Uno. He runs a place called Egg Studios, which is named because there's egg crate dampening crate foam all over the wall. So it's called Egg Studios. And this guy was more known for pop music, like the Young Fresh Fellows, who I admit I have not heard a note of, but I only know about because they get a shout out on They Might Be Giants' Flood album in a song called Twisting. But anyway, not fuzzy music like that.
Definitely not gnarly like this at all. He is known for a completely different thing at this point.
Exactly. So to the point where even when they call him up and they go, Steve goes, hey, Conrad, we're interested in having you record the next Mudhoney record. And Conrad just kind of, after a pause, goes, why? and then there's like nothing else, and Steve's like, all right, that's the right answer, let's go, let's do it. Record goes by pretty quickly. It's mostly live, blowing your mind here. 8 tracks with no bounces down as far as I can tell, so very few overdubs overall. And the good news is the band's fairly happy with what they've made, but in between recording and release, they somewhat scatter to the winds. Again, Mark's doing heroin. Steve Turner goes back, try to finish up college. And this break in the band's touring schedule is exacerbated by extensive delays in getting the record printed because the label, Sub Pop, is dangerously close to bankruptcy. They aren't even able to pay Mudhoney any back royalties. Like, they already owe them money on previous stuff. But because Mudhoney are friends with these guys, they're unnaturally patient with them. Unlike another band, sorry, can't help but make these digressions, called Nirvana. So quick excursion into Nirvana history here, which does wrap back to the Mudhoney story. Nirvana have not broken big yet at this point. They've recorded some singles, they've gotten some buzz around town, but their lineup is still shifting a lot. So in late 1990, just before Every Good Boy gets recorded, Nirvana parts ways with drummer Chad Channing and recruits Mudhoney's Dan Peters to play on a track called Sliver. They even take some press photos with Dan and give indications to Dan that he's the new guy if he wants it. This is from Dan Peters himself. But shortly thereafter, they get introduced to Dave Grohl. They head into the studio with him to record Nevermind, and Dan is also salty. He was led on here, and then he missed the chance to be on one of the biggest selling albums of all time. So if you're counting, that's 2 salty Mudhoneys so far.
To be fair, I would be pretty salty about that too. That's not something I would easily forget, I think.
Yeah. Especially, we haven't mentioned that there's like a Pearl Jam song called Lukin that is basically about Eddie Vedder hanging out at Matt Lukin's house after he had like a stalker show up at his house. So, and this is way later on in their career. So you're still friends with all the guys that were right there with you that are now worth like $100 million. And you're like, yeah, you know, I still am kind of playing at smaller places. And he's like, oh, that's cool. I just toured Europe and made like $36
playing
million
arenas.
in the last 5 years. You know?
Lukin is literally a carpenter now, as far as I can tell.
His primary occupation is drinking and bitching. But yeah, he also does works with wood as well.
Sounds like every carpenter I've ever known, by the way.
To be fair, both Nirvana Nirvana and Pearl Jam both, and probably some of these other bands helped, brought Mudhoney on tour a lot. Tom, you even mentioned, I think last week, that's how you saw Mudhoney opening for Pearl Jam, right? And so they paid it back as much as they could. Okay, we're getting to the end. We're going to get to the song soon, but one more note about Nirvana and Mudhoney. Steve Turner swears that Chris Novoselic cornered him at a party around the same time in late 1990 and asked him to join as a second guitar in Nirvana. But Steve's like, no, you guys are great as a trio. I don't want to do that. And Steve, to his credit, seems like he's really chill dude and, has contextualized all this, compartmentalized his whole life. He says he really did mean it at the time. He thought Nirvana sounded great as a three-piece, and he didn't want to screw that up. But at the time, he was also a little pissed at Nirvana for the slight against his drummer, Dan Peters.
Against Danny, yeah.
Meanwhile, Pat Smear's like, yeah, sure.
Right, yeah.
I think that the moral of the story that I'm taking from this is I'm going to say yes to any project I'm ever asked to join again for the rest of my life.
Then you have to actually show up and do the work, though. That's the hard part.
Well, that's a tomorrow problem.
Okay. And just to round out the anecdote's whole connection to Sub Pop's finances, Nirvana also started at Sub Pop. That's what I was making reference to, but kind of being unimpressed by them right around this time as an organization and their ability to pay back royalties for some of those early singles, they went out and sought a major label deal for Nevermind and got it. And Sub Pop is still quite salty about that, I should point out. But part of that deal, interestingly, would continue to pay a vig, pun intended, for every copy of Nevermind sold back to Sub Pop. So basically, Sub Pop did continue to make money on Nevermind, even though they didn't release it. And of course, the amazing sales of Nevermind also made people want to buy Bleach, Nirvana's earlier album, on Sub Pop. And so that all helped the label immensely. And that's why Sub Pop continues to this day. But that would all come later. They're right on the brink right now. So to wrap up the Mudhoney tale, the record's done, but it's unclear if it's going to be released or when. And with their lead singer adrift and their guitar player back in college, it's unclear what the future of the band is. The band decides to call Sub Pop's bluff, book a large-scale fall tour to force Sub Pop to print their record in time to capitalize on that. Which brings us to our favorite segment here on the podcast. It's called By the Numbers, and it really is our favorite. We have an unquenchable thirst for numerical humor, one that simply cannot be slaked. So, Mudhoney, By the Numbers. First number I'll give you is 75,000. That is the number of copies sold of Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge after being released in July of 1991. This was a huge, huge success for an independent label like Sub Pop at the time. Now they're a much more established company. They've released, obviously, they have the Nirvana catalog, back catalog. They released Fleet Foxes. There's a million other bands. Sub Pop's a much bigger organization now. But at the time, the brisk sales of Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge kept them from bankruptcy. It got them from red into black, even if just barely, and kept them afloat until that sweet, sweet Nirvana money could come through.
Seems ironic that they got to be like sort of the golden goose for this organization, seeing as how we're just shitting on their ability to generate revenue.
It's all in comparison to the other bands.
Remember, this record came out before Nevermind did. So it's like, it was a huge deal for them. It was a lifesaver.
This is July 91, and a couple months later, we're talking 10, Nevermind are all coming out.
Is Mudhoney walking around the scene like king shit when they release in July? And they're like, yeah, we're selling like 75,000 copies. And then like 3 months later, Nirvana's like, yeah, we just sold like 4 million copies of our debut album. Of Nevermind. Yeah.
Pretty much. Okay, next number I want to throw out to you is number 34. This record was most successful in the UK, where it charted at 34 and stayed there for months. And just to put it in context, we already talked about the marketing strategy that effectively sold bands like Mudhoney to the UK. But at the time, it was insane for an independently released record to make the charts in the UK. That was a major coup and probably a downstream result of that savvy marketing strategy, but it was unheard of at the time. And the last number I want to throw out to you is 0. That's the number of people in this band who know how to tune a guitar properly. When speaking of the title, Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, Mark Arm says, I think we were coming back from a tour and our guitars were out of tune. I couldn't remember what the notes were. And Steve goes, Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, which actually turned out to be a terrible tuning. Even Sonic Youth doesn't use that one.
Wow.
When I first saw the album title, my brain went back to like the treble clef, the shorthand, or the mnemonic.
So I have many questions here. I have more.
I didn't know people were extending that to your guitar tuning.
So first of all, yeah, even Sonic Youth didn't use that one. Is a pretty funny noise rock boosh.
That's amazing. No, yeah, that's.
But and that would be an absolutely terrible tuning. So first off, every good boy deserves Fudge as a mnemonic to remember how the lined notes on the staff, like on sheet music on a treble clef, go. That's what you were thinking of, and that is a commonly understood mnemonic. The mnemonic they were thinking of for a guitar is something like "Even all dummies get better eventually." That would describe the strings. My second point is that a guitar has 6 strings in total, and there are only 5 words in the phrase. So that should have been a clue. But perhaps most importantly, the line was, "We were coming back from a tour and our guitars were out of tune." This implies that the members of Mudhoney tuned their guitars once per tour. I am exaggerating for comedic effect.
It's the thing that happens on the show. I understand.
Speaking of your own musical hygiene, we're here every week to help you understand these things, like how to tune a guitar properly. It's important, even if you're a bass player and your entire concept of music theory is that if it sounds bad, just slide 1 fret in either direction and it'll sound good again. That was a boosh against bass players, but Alan already supported that in an earlier comment. So
I do. I lean into that hardcore. Yeah.
We want to entertain you. We want to educate you at the same time. And that's why we're putting in the work week over week to bring you this always free show. And we thank you very sincerely for using your valuable time to listen to us. It really does mean a lot. And if you want to go farther to support creators like us, well, it's quite simple. Tell a like-minded friend about the show, leave us a 5-star rating on your podcast player of choice, or buy us a beer once a month over on our Patreon feed. We have a bunch of cool bonus content over there. More in the works all the time. We actually just released a bonus show diving into our individual guilty pleasure listens, the stuff we love but are a little embarrassed about loving. But ultimately, regardless of how you choose to support us or friends of the show, like Kona Neutron's Protonic Reversal, we appreciate you. Everything, all the links you need are in the show notes, as always. But thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay. 1 year later, Mudhoney signed to a major label, in part to save their friendships with the Sub Pop crew, because they're still on that edge. They haven't gotten their Nirvana money quite yet, and they just aren't really doing a great job of administering this small fledgling shop that's struggling. So they make the leap, and probably also because they see all their friends like Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam doing it. But 1991, as we all know, ended up being the year grunge really broke big. It was a crazy year for Seattle. Like, after all that stuff we mentioned about it being a corner of the country and a small town, and it really is still geographically quite a small place. Nevermind came out in September, 10 came out in August, Bad Motorfinger in October, and the spring of 1990 when Mudhoney were making this record, 1991, when they were making this record, none of that had happened yet. And so some credit definitely is deserved for blazing this trail. Mudhoney's releases leading up to major label successes we just name-checked, and to Sub Pop's efforts, I think, in exporting this Seattle music scene to the wider world. So certainly they deserve credit for that, whatever we're about to say about these individual songs. Shall we get into some songs, gents?
Sure.
All right. Let's get back into the first single off this record, and we played a clip of it at the top, but let's go drop into another spot. It's called Let It Slide.
Hell to pay. Hell to pay. Hell to pay. Hell to pay. Lay on you to the grave. Nobody's here to stay. Oh, 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 oh.
I love that there's slide used in the song as well as in the title. That's always a nice thing, right? I think this song rips, and I think it comes right after a song called Generation Genocide that heavily features the farfisa, which is something that they use in this record as an idea of trying to build and kind of get away what they had done on the record before and they had done on Superfuzz Big Muff. 8 tracks only on this one, by the way. Like, this is like recorded on a track. Like, so they had to make very important decisions about what went where. Not like, how it is today, we just stack track and track and track. I think it's great. I think if you are not into Mark Arm's sort of like more punk rock style of singing, maybe it's torture for you. I don't know. I think it's got hooks. I think it's a killer song. And I think it's placed well on the record very early on. It's a level set.
I think it's a fun tune. I think this definitely sounds perhaps the most like a Lost Nirvana track to me, which I mean is a compliment. And I think the songwriting very clearly has a point of view. Like, I can tell right away that something is being said here. They own you to the grave. That's like a very punk idea. It feels a little more thought out. I also think this is a pretty decent modality for Mark Arm's voice. So I didn't really have the reaction Tom had about how his vocal was being produced. Mm-hmm. I think that these two ways you hear his vocal in this are both pretty good. I kind of wish they used this song as a template for other songs.
Listen, I just wish that when he goes up and he's doubling his vocals the whole time and he goes up with just one of the vocals and not with the other vocal, just mute the lower vocal. It's like they didn't have the confidence in the shout. And I think that the lower vocal takes away from the intensity that the shout is bringing to it. And that's my main complaint with this song. Otherwise, I do think the song rips. And Dan Peters sounds fantastic on this track, which he does on every track. But this one really highlights good, intense, well thought out drum beats and just a solid rhythm section in general. And every band needs a solid rhythm section. Like, no matter what kind of music you're playing, if your rhythm section sucks, you suck.
Yeah, the opening salvo of drumming is particularly intense on this one. Yeah.
Again, statement of intent style,
I thought this was a cool tune. On one hand, I'm surprised that it was a single, but on the other hand, I don't know what else might be other than Conan, you alluded to, the other possibility that we'll talk about. There's just some weird things about the song, and I'm definitely nitpicking, I'm complaining. There's a really long fade into this song that doesn't seem like it's connected to the first track, which, by the way, the first track, I know we're not focusing on that. That first track had me fucking bought in. Like, I was ready for some Iron Butterfly, Edgar Winter
Alice Cooper
shit.
band, yeah.
Dude, and I don't think the rest of the album delivered on that initial hype that I felt, but I thought the fade in was a little weird. I'm also, and I don't love Dinosaur Jr., Sonic Youth bands because of this. I'm not a guitar player, but I just do not. The last 30 seconds of this song, it just feels like it's too much noise. And it honestly, I'm not trying to degrade the skill involved or whatever, but it just feels like somebody plugged in a pedal and just started making noise for 30 seconds. I don't like when bands do that on a record. It just bumps me a little bit. Maybe I'm a square or whatever, but those were some issues I had with it. But overall, I thought it was a decent, kind of tone setter for the rest of the album.
It's odd. I have the last 30 seconds of the song marked down as I particularly like the kind of noise breakdown. I actually think that they achieve what they're going for and they really commit to let's just noise it out for the end.
Oh, they commit. I didn't say they didn't commit to it.
Yeah, I don't mind noisy solos like this. I think they were created in the way that you suggested, Alan, but that works just fine for me because it's just chaotic on purpose and trying to give a sense of energy. I reject a little bit Conan's comment on the 8 tracks. I mean, I don't think a lot of production went into this record, and that's okay. That's not really a knock against it, but it's 4 mics on the drums, and there's 4 other guys there, and so that leaves, or there's 3 other instruments there, and that leaves 1 overdub, and that's usually what they do.
Well, the other tracks were available, right? They just opted not to utilize the other tracks, or...
Well, they could have bounced. They could have done bouncing like the Beatles, but they did not.
Yeah, but also think about where they were at. And again, we mentioned that they were almost... Steve's specific complaint to me about, on my show, when we talked about the self-titled record, is that he felt they were just repeating themselves from Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge. Which, by the way, when it was released on CD, it was after the self-titled album came out. So that's why I got it twisted earlier on. Because vinyl I didn't know from when I was in high school. Sorry, I wasn't born cool, everybody. I got there through work.
So to be clear, the self-titled is the first full length, but the first release was called Super Fuzz Big Muff, and it was an EP that they later appended singles to release as a CD, I'm sure.
No, I was just saying, so what they're trying to do is they're trying to, again, going back to the Nuggets thing, right? Trying to make something where it's song-based, but not as much sound-based. and using a more limited palette to do that.
I don't have a problem with that. I'm just objecting to the idea that they poured over the production. I think it's trying to sound like a live band in a room with a lot of energy, and I think it mostly succeeds at that.
Yeah, I can't deny the energy.
I think they rip, especially at no point have I ever seen Mudhoney not rip, by the way. Like, they're pretty consistently ripping. But at the time, they were, think about what everything else was happening, not the least of which is just, Sub Pop not having the money and kind of giving you the runaround to even pay you what they're owed, and kind of seeing maybe a limited future for this band that is full of potential at the same time of a possibility.
Well, I will say, going back to the intensity factor of it, I think that tends to be where the album will lose me, because I do think that the music is generally very intense, and I just don't think that Mark Arm raises his voice to that level of intensity. I do feel like sometimes it sounds like he's not trying, and we're going to get to a song very soon where it sounds like he's not trying.
I think Mark is definitely the weak point in the band, and it sounds like he was only half engaged, and he didn't. I understand his punk aesthetics would not allow him to get better at singing, but I'm sorry, that's just fucking dumb.
Well, I think the other point I'll make too about the intensity, which I generally like, I think it's a good sign when bands are really going for it. But I think, Rob, when we did the Slater Kinney episode recently, it was either you or Tom that brought up that they're in that record very intense, very driving, a lot of similarities, even in general, just being from Washington and everything. Comment was made that there wasn't any dynamics at all, and there wasn't much opportunity for your brain to just catch a breath a little bit. And I would levy a sort of similar criticism on this album, where I feel like, and even on some of the longer songs, one of which we'll talk about, I mean, there's just not a lot of diversity in, I don't need tons of changes. I'm not like a prog rock guy, but it didn't feel like there's a lot of mode shifting or dynamics to just let you re-ground at all.
To be honest, there's more than I would have thought, so I kind of object to that. And maybe this is a good segue to talk about the next song, which I do think feels quite a bit different. It's called Good Enough.
Whatever happens, never thought for a second that I'd let go. Everybody says you must have lost your head. Well, one more time is good enough for me. Yeah, one more time is good enough for me.
So after I just shit on Mark Arm, I think he sounds the best possibly on the record here.
Are you kidding me? Oh my God. My note on this one is, hey, Mark, do you want to try another vocal take with feeling, enunciation, or accuracy? And he's like, no, it's good enough. That's the feeling I got from this song.
Should have been the single. One of my favorite Mudhoney songs. I think the disaffected vocal delivery absolutely works here, especially when you think about the fact that one of the biggest hooks in it is the drum pattern. This is all Danny on here, right?
Yeah.
And but then when it kicks in and the fuzz hits, it's classic Mudhoney. It's surreptitious hooks. It's the kind of thing that they never would have done in the Super Fuzz Big Muff days, or had the panache to do, or first record, as a perfect example of what they were trying to push forward with at that time, which is just play with the form a little bit. And again, does it sound like that in 2024 with you guys not having been familiar with it? Apparently not, but definitely this being the first Mudhoney that I heard, it was, I was like, there was not Touch Me I'm Sick, I should say. I was like, is this the same band? Whoa, this is interesting.
Yeah, they definitely sound, the context of listening to Touch Me I'm Sick and Super Fuzz Big Muff is helpful, because they do sound a fair amount different within, I guess it depends on how you think about it, but I think it's different enough to call it progress for sure. Again, the drums sound great. Agree with that.
Is he playing brushes on those drums?
There's like a shaker in there somewhere, right?
There's definitely a shaker in there, and it's like a lot of snare work. But like, yeah, I don't know if it's brushes or not. There's a
I think
video.
if you listen to the snare work, there's no crack, there's no pop or anything like that. So I think he's using brushes on that, which I was like, that's a very interesting choice for a band whose aesthetic is like kind of fuzzed out heavy,
right?
To just have like a really light touch on the drums.
It's got that dead drum tone that I dig that.
Yeah.
I did like this song actually, and I actually made a comment booshing myself, being like, maybe I'm just like soft or something, but this song I felt like I don't always need pop sugar in everything, but I did feel like it just had a little bit more feeling. And I actually, Tom, I won't argue with your point about the vocals on this because it's to each their own, certainly. But I kind of liked his affect on this. I think I got the sense he was intentionally laying on the affect a little bit and going for a little bit of kind of whininess that I thought it worked on this song where it might not have worked on others.
I agree. It totally works. I think it was 100% intentional. The other band that this reminded me of is The Replacements. It kind of sounds like a dirty, thoughtful pop song. And I think the lyrics are actually pretty decent here as well. That plus the drum beat or the percussion that's going on. I took note that Conrad Uno, the engineer that worked with them, said of Mark Arm, he's a terrible singer, but he's a great terrible singer. I like him just fine. I think he fits with this band, at least on some of the tracks. I do think it's about knowing your limitations a little bit, though. And so I think it works really great here.
I honestly thought that you were going to say that this was your low point of the focus list, Rob. This is my low point of the focus list.
Blows my mind. Wow.
I know. It really does come down to the vocal delivery. I don't care if that's what you were trying to do. Congratulations on accomplishing something I don't like, I guess. I'm not saying that I'm right.
That's good because you're not.
From the kind of moment one that he opened his mouth, I was just like, yeah, all right. I'm often wrong. I don't know if I am in this scenario, though.
All right. Yeah. Here's my actual response. Are you ready? Tom, you ignorant slut. I'm kidding. I did.
Speaking of all that, let's move it on to the next song on the focus list called Broken Hands.
I could feel you coming. I felt so hanging on so tight for life while the bones in your head got how come I always know when the worst is gonna come? Sometimes it's so hard to know when you can't change what's gonna come.
I picked this as the low point, but not because it sounds bad or really that different. It's because it vastly overstays its welcome and goes on for 6+ minutes. And I think that this band is best when they get in and get out quick and leave me wanting more. That intensity cannot be sustained. Not to mention this is a down-tempo song. And I get it. They're trying to do like a Neil Young Cowgirl in the Sand type thing. But I just don't think the material or the vocal in this case, which is super whiny, is there to sustain it. And speaking of the Neil Young comparison, the first solo at like 2:30 that Steve launches into is the least Neil Young solo I can imagine.
Yeah.
It's just slow and plodding and unmelodic. It can't be all those things.
So, but the opening of the song just is the end of Cinnamon Girl, basically, right? That da-na-na-na-na-na that he plays at the end of Cinnamon Girl, that's literally the opening notes that they play here. So I got hardcore Neil Young vibes from this. And this was my favorite song that you put on the focus list, I have to say.
That deeply shocking. Okay.
Yeah, I dig the sludgy vibes. I mean, yes, you're right. It's 6 minutes of essentially the same chord pattern. It gets a little old, but it comes back around for me. I feel like it's one of those things you hang out for it long enough and it comes back. And I think that the vocal mixing works so much better on this than it does on Let It Slide, where they let him go up and they don't undercut him with a lower vocal. So you get a little bit more of that intensity. And I feel like he was pushing a little bit more on it and was maybe invested more in it. I don't know. I really like this song.
I didn't care for the song at all, shockingly. And I was and still am a little bit scared to levy my criticism because I know how cliche it is. But like, this does not need to be. This is not a 6 minute song. It's just not. There's not enough meat on the bones. With some variation, with some layering, with some complexity, there's maybe the building blocks within the song, but I don't think they do enough with it. I actually don't like the vocals. Yeah, this one, this was a little bit of a miss for me.
That's all right. Maybe if you guys respected good art, you would like this song.
Well, all right. So I agree it's too long. This is probably my least favorite song on the record. I think There's Nothing Broken Hands does that Checkout Time, the closing song on here, doesn't do better in half the time. Frankly, I was a little surprised to see this on here because I just find it kind of forgettable when we don't have a Who You Driving Now, which I think is incredible, or Into the Drink even. But I get it. You got to show it as totality. And there's a series of records they have. I think the fifth, Now We've Become Translucent, the one after Tomorrow Hit Today, I think the sixth record, where they really went for it like Psych style. All the songs are like longer. And it's cool, and I like it, and it's not one I really go to that often. It's not my favorite mode of theirs. I don't dislike it. I often forget it's there. But if I had to pick a what's your least favorite, yeah, sure, this one. Yeah, I mean, like, it's fine.
In case we haven't mentioned it enough, the drums hold it down again. Cannot talk any shit on this drummer.
Peters,
It's tribal.
MVP.
It's intense.
Yeah. He's a badass.
Yeah, definitely the MVP. Okay.
And you know what? Matt Lukin gets some on this song too. There's not a lot of times that I feel like the bass gets to shine a little bit. And I feel like the bass gets to shine on this song, especially in the verse. He's doing some nice, really melodic stuff that I feel is pretty driving.
Well, when the singer is barely singing a melody, you need the bass to pick up the melodic slack. So
he actually is not given enough credit as a songwriter and musician. That like he given a lot of great stuff, and that's why it's interesting. When he left, they got Guy Madison, who's fantastic, but a finger player instead of a pick player like Lukin, and like almost a totally different style entirely. Yet somehow they managed to make it work, which is crazy because the first thing I heard when Lukin gone, I was like, well, I guess that's Mudhoney gone. And the fact that they didn't, it was interesting. And I think actually kind of inspiring because they found new ways to be creative and move forward. Especially in the early days, he was the best musician out of a lot of them.
No, I disagree, but okay.
From
Let's
the
move on
perspective of
to-
being a person that like plays in a band and knows their role and can arrange and do things along those lines. He doesn't give credit for that.
I got no problems with him. I'm just saying the drummer is clearly the best person in the band. I think it's obvious. But we can agree to disagree. So, moving on.
Danny Peters, I'm never going to talk shit about Danny Peters. He's amazing.
Are we not going to do a 15-minute excursion on finger versus pick playing and bass? Alan and I are ready to go.
It's fine not to. I've heard it.
Well, do you want to at least explain what you're referring to just in brief, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, there's two different ways to play the bass. One is that you use your fingers to pluck the strings or to strike the strings. The other is that you use a pick to strike the strings, and a pick has a more kind of sharp and immediate attack to it, and the fingers have a little bit more of a, I wouldn't say muted, but it's less attacky. But a lot of players will say that you can do more interesting things with your fingers because you have multiple things to strike the strings with as opposed to just one pick. And it lends itself to a different style, and it lends the bass to sit differently in the mix versus where, you know, when you're playing with a pick, the bass can jump out front a little bit more. When you're playing with your fingers, there are oftentimes you sit a little bit more back, and the way to jump out tends to be more through rhythmic and or melodic things as opposed to just like a volume attack that the pick will have you jump out.
And Matt Lukin does which of those things?
Matt Lukin is a pick player.
Can we track engagement stats? Like, is there a sharp drop off in listenership, like right in the meat of that segment?
At least Phil's not here trying to talk about the D6 to the D to the D to the back to the D minor 6 chord shit, you know.
Phil's always taking strays. Love it.
Even we tune him out when he starts talking. Okay, let's move on here. I don't want to be here all night. Next song is called Fuzz Gun 91.
This song fucking rocks. I really like this song a lot.
This is my overall favorite. I thought this was great, fast, fun, leaning into the garage rock. Little Jimi Hendrix rolled in there. For some reason, I find the title very funny. I like when people put in a year next to titles like this.
Yeah, I like that as well.
They're not shying away from the fuzz angle
No.
on anything that they do. I think that's pretty cool. Yeah, this actually reminded me a little bit of a more truncated "Search and Destroy." I think is the song,
Yes,
the Stooges
yes.
song. It's just got that like get in, get out, no wasted movements on this.
Listen, I will say that the rhythm section sounds absolutely fantastic on this song. It does sound like Steve Turner is maybe hanging on by the fingernails a couple of times in some of the stuff that he's doing. And that's not even to say he sounds bad. I just think that there's like a real locked in tightness to the rhythm section. And sometimes when Steve Turner's doing a little bit more on the guitar, he's not quite as locked in. Again, I'm not saying he sounds bad, and I think he's a good guitar player.
Yeah.
But I did feel like there was a little bit of a contrast, especially during some of those kind of dropouts where he's trying to do runs and stuff. It's like the rhythm section is just so tight.
Well, we've talked about it on this show, but this is one of those bands where they're very actively going like, did the take have good energy?
Yeah.
Then I don't really care that much about the little mistakes.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is it's just an older aesthetic, and I think that's perfectly fine. So we're not calling out all the times they're maybe slightly off. That's pointless because they probably knew it as well.
They have a sloppy aesthetic, and I don't say that in a derogatory way. I think they would probably even. I get the sense that they're all about it and would not distance themselves from that term.
Well, Steve Turner's looking across the room at his lead singer who's strung out, and he's like, I got to get to economics class later
Yeah,
today.
the man is literally trying to finish college because he said he would, which is amazing. But like, also, I think that it's notable too that like he's a feel player, right? Like, especially talk about like technically precise guitar players. You can talk about like feel players. Neil Young was invoked earlier. Neil Young, he's the most feel player of feel players. He's all feel.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes he's not even all tuning, but he's all feel.
I got no problem with any of that. This one, maybe it's something about removing Mark Arm's voice. I do think some of the songs, the vocals are holding it back because it distracts from the fun of what a raucous, live, energetic band is. And so this one being an instrumental, like I really had this sense. There's this point at like 45 seconds in when they hit the first big hits, the 3 bop, bop, bop set of hits, that I just had this image in my mind very clear of them all just smiling at each other across the room, like taking the piss on some rock tropes and just fuzzing everything up and having fun with it. It just felt fun.
The thing about at the time too, again, what they were trying to get away from is their idea was that like everything was becoming diet heavy metal and like all like super serious. So they're mining this crazed like garage rock energy with punk rock ferocity, right? And that's perfect example of that here. And this one, crazily enough, wouldn't be out of place on a Super Fuzz Big Muff, frankly. But it's coming at it from a band that's more comfortable with themselves. They know what they can do, and they know what their strengths are. And I think that it's presented well here.
Great. Let's round it out here with the last song we're going to talk about. It's called Poking Around. I don't know why that title is just funny. It sounds way more wholesome than this band is.
So who knew that harmonica was what I was missing when the song came? You're like, oh yeah, a little harmonica, not bad.
I went through a journey with this song where it's later in the album and I was getting a little bit frustrated. 10 seconds in, I literally just laughed out loud to myself when the harmonica came in because I was just like, what the fuck was that? It did grow on me that like as the song went along, I was like, okay, this feels like it belongs, but at first I was very incredulous at the inclusion of a harmonica. It seemed just wholly nonsensical, but I think it works on the whole.
I love that this song is anti-pop. It starts out feeling like it's going to be a pretty accessible pop song, and then they just start throwing curveballs at you. like they never let you sit for more than about 15 seconds before they just change the rhythm, change the chords in a drastic way. Great examples right at 1:30. They've done their intro with the hook. They do kind of a verse and they come back to that hook for like 2 seconds. And you think that they're going to drop back into the hook. And then they're like, no, drastic chord change into a chorus that has no relation to the rest of the song. It also has a lot more chord changes than the chorus has any right having. And we're just going to hammer that. I was like, yeah, I kind of dig that. That was a little bit of a fuck you to like pop, which I can respect.
And yet it still sounds poppy in a really positive way. That's the reason I liked it as well, because it kind of sneaks a little bit of that avant-garde weirdness in to something that kind of sounds like a grunge version of The Cure.
Totally. Okay.
Do you know what I mean? There's aspects of like a power punk thing going on.
Yeah.
I mean that positively.
No. I get it. I get it.
Fun, digestible tune. It's driving. And I do think the harmonica just adds a nice welcome extra texture here. So it stood out for that reason. And this is the one where I noticed the bass, that I thought the bass got some moments to shine here very nicely.
Yeah, it was poking through and poking around at the same time. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah, it seems like the bass player was also on the fuzz train. I picked up on that specifically bass-wise on this tune as well.
And I know we've given enough hand-jos to Dan Peters, but good Lord, that hi-hat work on this song is really nice. It's really good.
Oh, he's great. I mean, he's one of the most underrated rock drummers, right? I mean, like, it's got to be up there. Yes. He's fucking fantastic. Like, what is there to say?
I'll sign on for that one, certainly. I'm coming out of this week now happily knowing the work of Dan Peters, certainly, at least that.
And you hear Dan Peters was in the running to be the drummer for Nirvana, and then Dave Grohl took over. And you're like, well, of course Dave Grohl took over. But then you listen to this album, you're like, actually, I mean, he's fucking great. So it might have had a slightly different flavor to the Nirvana songs, but he wouldn't have been lacking.
But it would have been different. Right. It's not that one is like better than the other. It's their styles are so different. Like there's a lot of technical precision with what Dan Peters does. There's a lot of like quickie, like jazzy kind of things along those lines. Well, Dave Grohl's all power and pump, if you will. Pump and power.
All right. I think we've gabbed quite enough about this record. It's time to put it to a vote. Every good boy deserves Fudge. Is it a must listen before you die? I'm going to throw it first to Tom.
Oh, Rob, why you got to go to me first? So here's the thing. I like the album. I would put this on the list for influence, but I don't think that the timing of the influence of this album and the grunge scene line up, because the grunge scene was coming to a maturity already, and I can't say that like 10 or Bad Motorfinger or Nevermind, which, like it or not, were the defining albums of that sort of 1991 grunge scene, were already in the making at that point. I will absolutely sign on for Superfuzz Big Muff being on the list, because I do think that you can trace the roots of that to more influence on the broader movement. But this album, I'm going to say no, even though I did like the album, and like Rob and probably I assume Conan, I will listen to this album again. But I can't put two other albums on the list, and I have to say that I think that Superfuzz Big Muff, which I also enjoyed, but you're right, is a little bit more out there, was what I think would be the qualifying album for the list in terms of how essential it is. I will tell all of our listeners, go listen to this album. It's fun. But if you don't listen to it before you die, you're not going to be on your deathbed taking your last breath like, oh man, I got one regret in life, and it's that I didn't listen to Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge.
A lot of caveats. It's like you could hear the emails already being written, Tom.
I know. I'm just looking at Conan's face as I'm saying it. I'm like, I got to soften this.
I'm trying to stay nonplussed because it's the show, and I know what the show is, but
Alan, what say you?
I almost got over the finish line, I would say, with this. Clearly, true to form, started the show in a very snarky fashion and evolved to a point where I do feel close to putting this over the line, but it just does not do it for me. And I think essential is the word I keep going back to. I actually do think their first record, to me, speaks to me a little bit more. I look forward to, at some point, if we're still doing this, when the randomizer gives us that again, to diving in there.
Hold on a second. The random.
Have you been on this show before?
I don't know. I don't know why I.
Oh yeah, that's what you call it, right?
The Albinator. I'll give you a clean, editable.
There you go.
Oh
take
no, we're
there.
keeping all that. We're keeping all that, man.
Yeah,
Your shame
that's
was
cool.
on.
That's cool. But yeah, I would say the same thing. Normally, influence again. I'm repeating what you said, Tom, but it doesn't feel like it's enough to carry the day for me. I think there's some cool moments. They don't take themselves seriously. I love everything that they're about, but strictly on the merits, if I listened to this in a vacuum, I would not come away feeling like it's worth recommending someone must listen to. So it's a slightly reluctant no.
Conan, what say you?
Well, surprising nobody. I absolutely think they should be included. I think it should be included for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is if you have is Sheryl Crow on this list? I mean, Jesus Christ.
I'm not signing on to that one. All right, we're not endorsing that.
Take that with Phil.
There's a lot of albums on this list that it's like, okay, I could see where if somebody doesn't have the frame of reference of the world that I come up in, the world that I literally still play in and still make records in and whatever, that maybe it wouldn't be of interest to them. But I think it's interesting enough to hear a song like Good Enough. It has these weird pop hooks again, where the biggest hook is the drum beat it's going. It's all potentially brushes. I think it's brushes in the video. And hear these sounds deployed in such a way that they started off with the one thing that people still to this day, if they are known for that thing, and they push themselves outside of that, celebrating a genre of music at the time was not cool to be celebrating, and put their own spin on and did their own things and decided to expand the songwriting in very interesting ways. You don't have to be a Mudhoney fan to be better off having listened to this record afterwards, even if you can't stand Mark Arm's vocals, and even if you maybe find one of the songs at least tiresomely long, which it is. And like I said, for some reason I can just get past that. I just never seek it out necessarily. And I also think that, two of my favorite songs in there we didn't even cover. And I think that this is a record I listen to electively all the time. I don't know. I find something very comforting and interesting about it. And I like the vibe a lot. And Mudhoney is nothing if not a vibe band. And I think is deployed incredibly effectively here. And they are still underrated among the pantheon of bands that came from Seattle around this time.
Well said. But it's all for naught, Conan, because I'm not going to keep you in suspense. I gained a lot of appreciation for this band over this research. I think they seem like cool guys, or at least a couple of them do. I think the record's a ton of fun. If anyone's still listening that's a Mudhoney fan, when you will inevitably write and tell us how much we shit on this, I'm telling you right now, I enjoyed the damn record. It's a good record. It's a fun record. It's rock and roll. I get it. I don't really have a problem. I was nitpicking. But is it essential? This is a much different question. That's a much higher bar. I don't hear a Touch Me, I'm Sick on this record. That's the bottom line. And for a band that strikes its whole place in history, I do think has to do with its influence and We Were Here First. Beyond that, what is it really? It's watered down Stooges, Conan. Let's be honest.
Oh, saving the best for last.
Shots are fired.
So unfortunately, Mudhoney, as much as I know the audience is going to be mad, no, it's a no for me. Sorry, guys. Just didn't quite make it.
I mean, look at it this way. Suck You Dry is one of my favorite Mudhoney songs. Piece of Cake is not the best Mudhoney record, and even they would tell you that. So, I mean, it all depends on your perspective, right?
Yeah, but even throughout this conversation, Conan, you've referenced so much else from the catalog that's not here. And so I agree that Mudhoney is underrated. I'll happily sign on to that. I think people should listen to them. I think people should know about them, and I don't think they got a fully fair shake given what they helped start and where they came from. However, that doesn't mean that this particular record is essential. I look forward to revisiting the first release. I'm excited about that when it comes. But
On the Albinator.
the scrolls have been inscribed. Yeah, glad you remembered that this time out.
You have to check your hand and be like, oh,
On
Albinator. There
the
we go.
checks notes, Albinator.
We've been talking quite long enough. Let's round it out with two more pieces of business before we get going. The first, the mic stays with me. It's the mailbag. We have some feedback on the Bonnie Raitt episode. I thought Bonnie Raitt and Mudhoney, they should pretty much do a collaboration album
That actually
together.
might
So
be
it's
kind of
made-
awesome.
It's made perfect sense. So listener Scott writes in, "Hi guys, thanks for the podcast and the ambitious task you're taking on. I jumped on board at a friend's recommendation. Thank you, friend, and really appreciated how you broke down OK Computer. It was something I don't really love, but I respect. I almost quit you after your hatchet job on Steve Earle's Guitar Town, but I keep coming back around and I find that I agree with you more often than not. That's even true with last week's episode on Bonnie Raitt's Nick of Time. Yes, Raitt's early work is wonderful, even superior to this. Yes, the Chevy Chase rom-com era synth backwash is extremely dated and takes away from this work now, even if it was likely the ticket to Bonnie finally getting some richly deserved success. But don't let late 80s, early 90s production cause you to start mailing in your critique of John Hiatt's Thing Called Love. This is one of the most intelligent and enjoyable love songs of the 80s, written by a hardworking, talented, and overlooked singer in John Hiatt. This was your one chance to recommend his work, but instead Rob, that's me, throws out a comment that the line containing amoeba is a forced rhyme. Well, it was, Scott.
Yeah, that's the definition of a forced rhyme. Queen of Sheba and amoeba.
No, that's
as
bad.
the line. Yeah, that's bad.
You know what? I haven't really explored John Hiatt's catalog, but more power to him. I have respect from afar for a guy like that who I know has been putting in the work and is a songwriter, so I will happily relook at that. But Thing Called Love, as it appears on Bonnie Raitt's Nick of Time, I'm standing by my story. And we have one more piece of feedback. It's Jack from London. He writes, "Hey guys, love the Bonnie Raitt pod, even though I have absolutely no use for that album." And although our friend Phil isn't here, he logs a vote for who Phil's voice matches up to. And he says, "My vote for Phil's voice match is Demi Moore in Ghost." Terrifying thought.
Yes.
Okay, it would take me a while to get to that comparison.
Yeah, that's not my first, second, third, fourth, or 500 choice.
Whatever you want to tell us, good, bad, ugly, you want to call our Albinator by the wrong name, whatever you want to do, send it over to 1001albumcomplaints@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And now, to pick our homework for next week, we're going to kick it over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you to Conan for being on the show, man. Always a great pleasure to have you here. We really do appreciate you coming on. And you are a musical fucking encyclopedia. So thank you for that. I envy the lack of preparation that you have to do for these shows, because you're just like, I just kind of know all this stuff already. And I'm like, I just heard about this for the first time.
It's a wasted life, Tom. It really is. I do like mixing up with you guys, even when you're dead fucking wrong.
I have the Albatron, or what do we call it? The Albinator. That's the one. I have that in the corner. It has been doing heroin and playing a whole bunch of songs that it is just title first rating in the moment. And I'm going to give it a spin and see what we're going to be listening to next week. Conan, I'm just going to say you're probably going to be disgusted by whatever the band is on the list now, because, I mean, like, a lot of these are garbage. So let's spin that wheel and find out what we will be listening to
together
next week. The album, oh, God, I could not have planned this better. The album is Slippery When Wet, and the artist is John Bon Jovi.
Not a fan, by the way. Not a fan at all.
All credit to Bon Jovi for proving that himbos can also get by just on their looks and mediocre talent. And it's not just reserved for hot women, okay? I'm kind of excited for this album. I definitely listened to this album a lot growing up. Bad Medicine, I believe, is on this. You Give Love a Bad Name.
I'm scared that I might actually end up liking that, so I might have to sit that one out.
Wow, that's quite the change up.
Okay, great. Well, we hope you listen along with us to Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet, and we're going to have Conan write in his tweet-length review after this call so that his voice can be present. We can get him decrying something once.
All caps.
Regardless, listen along with us. Tune in next week. We're excited to dive into the whole story. And, Conan, sorry, lest I forget, plug your stuff again. 10th anniversary show. I know it's been a couple weeks in the past, but please let us know what's going on with Protonic Reversal.
Yeah. So just the 10-year Protonic Reversal episode just happened. It's a pretty audacious 3-hour episode that I kind of designed to be as much of a celebration of 10 years of doing this very intimate, informed, and irreverent podcast, but also sort of a calling card, like a good place to start for new listeners, new viewers, and things along those lines. Lots of other stuff coming up. Adult Prom by Conan Neutron and the Secret Friends, my band with Dale Grover of the Melvins, who Matt Lucan of Mudhoney was in a band with, called the Melvins. Still available, neutronfriends.bandcamp.com, Spotify, YouTube, all the other things. There is a new Conan Neutron and the Secret Friends record. I think it is going to be fall that it's coming out. Very excited to unleash that in the world. We have East Coast dates in October coming up. Details forthcoming. And movie night extravaganza. Those guys get pissed if I don't mention it, but I'm on a movie show as well, and it's a lot of fun also.
You do have a regular job, is that correct?
I do, yeah.
That's not these items. Yeah. You never stop, buddy. So keep doing it. Conan's fighting the good fight out there. Support him. Listen to Protonic Reversal or Movie Night Extravaganza. Check Conan out on the road. Listen to Conan Neutron and the Secret Friends. All of it. Support people who are out there with these labors of love.
And Conan has a very active Patreon as well for Protonic Reversal and other stuff. Yeah, go check that out. It's a lot of work to keep that shit up.
Right.
Conan is putting in the work. That's the point. So please, everybody out there, just support people like this as best you can. Okay, for everyone at the show, I have been Rob.
I've been Tom.
I'm Alan.
And I'm Conan Neutron.
Aboosh.